All right, 10th grade. Today we're going to be talking about imperialism in Asia during period 5. So let's get started. First, the context of Asian imperialism. It's important for us to remember what state is Asia in at the turn of 1750. So first, European states. First, it's important to remember that Portugal and Spain had a good amount of power in the Asian area, especially when it came to trade on the Indian and Pacific Ocean. They were able to have this power thanks to their use of trading post empires, as Portugal and Spain both had a good amount of important forts in trade areas on the oceans that gave them ability to tax and make wealth off that. At the same time, by 1750, the Portuguese and Spanish power were starting to decline, as new European powers, such as, well, not new, but new to the area European powers, such as the British, the French, and the Dutch, and their joint stock companies, began to have more and more and more of a role in the Asian area. At the same time, the Asian states that existed were still very powerful and ones that Europeans had to respect and had to work with to have any sort of power. These states include the Mughal in India, the Qing dynasty in China, Japan. All three dealt with Europeans in different ways. The Mughals had invited the British to have a significant. The Mughals invited the British to take part in trade, to build factories, and even in some areas collect tax, as the Mughals kind of viewed the British as another tool to use. The Qing were very wary of European cultural spread and the increased influence of Europeans, so they had the Europeans trade through only one port, the port of Canton in the south of China. Though the Chinese did allow some Christian missionaries, such as the Jesuits, who were Catholic, to serve in the court and to spread their message a little bit. And then finally, Japan was very isolationist at the time under the Tokugawa shogunate. They only allowed the Dutch, because they considered them to be the chillest, like the Dutch aren't going to try to convert us. They allowed the Dutch to trade in one port in the south of Japan. And their isolationism was so serious that if you were a European seen outside of that port in Japan, you were liable to be killed. So all three of them dealt with Europeans in different ways, and all of them are going to have to reckon with the increased European strength from industrialization. Cool, go ahead and pause here and answer question 1 about the context of Asian imperialism. Cool, you've answered question 1. Now we're moving on to the second part, imperialism in Asia. So we're going to go through each European power, or in one case America and Japan, and talk about their effect in Asia. First, the English. The English power was centered in two areas. First, India. In 1750, the British kicked France out of India and became basically the sole European country that dealt with the Mughal Empire. This defeat of the French, though, also showed local Indian states how powerful the British was, and they started to be seen as people to work with. The British employed an army of sepoys, which were Indian soldiers trained in European-style combat and equipped with better English-style weapons, which made them basically the most formidable military force in India. At the same time, the Mughal Empire was basically rotting from within and falling apart. So this once very mighty empire that all the Indians basically looked to was starting to fade, and the British were on the rise. The British thus used the weakening of the Mughals to do a few things. They began to take a part in a lot more in local politics, often siding with certain Indian states that promised fealty or vassalship to the British. They also just straight up conquered some areas using their more powerful army. It also helped that local Indian merchants and bankers viewed the British as the safe financial choice to be rulers, and often supplied them with finances that helped them continue running their army. Over about 100 years, the British ended up ruling about 2/3 of India by the time we hit 1850. And we're going to talk more about what happens after that in another lecture. The British also controlled Australia and New Zealand. They colonized those areas and used them as prisoner colonies, which would eventually grow in size and were used in different ways later on. But just know that Australia and New Zealand were colonized by the English. The next is the Dutch. The Dutch had early stakeholdship in the islands that we know today as Indonesia. Back then, there were a series of many small kingdoms, but the Dutch basically colonized and conquered most of Indonesia because Indonesia was a perfect place to grow various spices that sold for a lot of money. And the Dutch knew that they could make a lot of money off controlling and monopolizing this trade. So the Dutch colonized Indonesia, forced the Indonesians to work on spice plantations, and tax them like crazy to control this spice trade and make a lot of money off it. The next are the French. The French, after being kicked out of India, needed another place to form a colony to gain that sort of wealth from, especially as they were losing their colonies in North America. They turned to Vietnam, and this is because they had a connection to use as an excuse to take part in Vietnam. Throughout the 1700s, the French Catholic missionaries have been spreading the faith throughout Vietnam and Southeast Asia, often quite successfully. And what happened is that the Kingdom of Vietnam decided to outlaw Catholicism because they feared the growing power of Christianity along with European culture. So Catholicism was outlawed, and the French Catholic missionaries were forced to leave Vietnam. This led France to have an excuse to take over Vietnam. They said they were protecting Catholics, and they were protecting those. Basically, that was the argument, that they were protecting the Catholics of Vietnam. France, thus, by late 1800s, had colonized and conquered most of Vietnam and other parts of Southeast Asia, and formed a colony known as French Indochina. This gave them a fairly large Asian colony that they could use for raw resources and taxes. Lastly, we have Japan and America. By the end of the 1800s, Japan and America both gained their own small foothold of colonies in Asia. Japan, of course, is Japan is located in Asia, and we're going to talk more about their change later, but as they industrialized near the end of the 1800s, they needed raw resources. This led them to colonize Korea and some other islands, but Korea was their largest one, and use Korea as a place to get raw resources for their industry. America, they gained their toehold into the Asian sphere through the Philippines. The Spanish had colonized the Philippines back in the 1600s. The Americans took the Philippines from Spain. Their excuse was actually quite ironic. They said that they were actually liberating and saving the Philippines, but instead of letting the Philippines, rule themselves, the Americans said, no, white man's burden, we got to teach them how to be civilized. But we're here helping. We're much better than the Spanish. The Philippines also gave America a kind of a base of operations for trade and to have influence within Asia. Cool, we're going to pause here. You're going to answer question 2 about imperialism within Asia. Go ahead and go. Cool, we've answered question 2. Now we're going on to 3, the effects of colonial rule in Asia. First, all these colonies were known as colonies of exploitation. This is because through excluding Australia and New Zealand, these areas were already had a lot of people living there. Oftentimes they had already well-built and complicated governments. And so there wasn't really this need, and there wasn't this desire for Europeans or Americans to go move to these colonies and settle there. Instead, these colonies were used for 2 things. Get as much raw resources out of them as possible, gain as much taxes out of them as possible. So basically, these colonies were treated terribly and were wrung dry of as much taxes and as much raw resource they get out of them. Often, violence was used to make people work on these plantations and to pay their very, very heavy taxes, and thus it was common for rebellions to occur against these high taxes and be put down very violently. Ruling and how the Europeans rule is important to note as well. It would be very expensive to have a lot of Europeans basically rule over these colonies directly. Not only that, there were cultural language barriers that would make it very difficult. So how the Europeans often ruled their colonies was by using local elites. Basically, they would take the people who were often ruling there before the Europeans showed up and had them rule in the name of the Europeans. This allowed a group of people who already knew the language and the culture to much more effectively rule it. There would be a small group of Europeans, of course, who would be there to watch over and make sure the colonial administration was running well, but the majority of the colonial administration or government was made up of local elite. Now, these local elite had to do a few things to be a part of it. They had to assimilate basically to European culture. They had to learn the European language. They often converted to Christianity. They started to dress like Europeans. The whole point being is that they had to civilize themselves to be allowed to work in this colonial administration. Now, if they did that, though, these elites would maintain a lot of the power, a lot of wealth, and basically be made. But they had to start acting European in the process. It's important to note, though, that even as these local elite westernized and started to act more European, they were never considered equal to Europeans. That's impossible. Remember, the Europeans are the most civilized people. Lastly, religion and education. Of course, in all these colonies, religion was a very important part of it, this idea that they were spreading Christianity and helping the local people. Now, these missionaries who were spreading Christianity were also the ones educating the locals in European-style education. Now, it's important to state, the education that was given to the locals was often what they would call practical education, like how to work machinery, how some basic math and science. But the idea is that non-Europeans couldn't delve into the high-level science stuff. They weren't smart enough for that. So the point of the education was more to get them some basic skills so they could be effective workers. But once again, for any sort of colonial people to have any sort of wealth or power, they had to basically act European in all aspects, convert to Christianity, and even then be treated less. Last but not least, this education also emphasized the superiority of Europeans and basically told colonial people that they were not equal to Europeans and that they should be thankful as much as possible that the Europeans were bringing them culture and bringing them enlightenment. Cool with that, we're going to pause here and you're going to answer question 3. And that's the end.